The charity gala at the Fairmont Chateau Laurier had been sold out for months. Every seat in that gilded ballroom cost more than most people made in a week, and everyone who was anyone in Ottawa had been clamoring for a table since January. But for Reginald Thorne, the evening wasn't about raising money for children's hospitals. It was about watching his ex-wife walk in with nothing. He had made sure of that. The invitation had come to Mara Thorne 3 weeks earlier, slipped inside an envelope with the charity's letterhead, but Reginald's handwriting on the address line. She recognized it immediately, that precise, slightly slanted cursive he had spent years perfecting, because he believed good penmanship signaled good character. She had believed that once too. She had believed a lot of things about Reginald Thorne. The note inside was brief. "You were always such a supporter of the hospital foundation. I thought it only right that you be there. Bring whoever you like. Bring whoever you like," as if she had anyone left, as if the past 18 months hadn't stripped her down to the studs. Mara sat with the invitation on her kitchen table for a long time. The apartment was quiet, in the way that Toronto apartments get quiet on February evenings, when the cold presses against the windows and the radiators tick and hiss like they're arguing with themselves. She had moved here after the divorce was finalized, away from Ottawa, away from the house on Acacia Avenue, away from the social circle that had been Reginald's long before it ever became hers. She'd taken her clothes, her books, her daughter's old drawings from the refrigerator, and approximately 40% of what a judge had determined she was owed. The other 60% was still being negotiated, because Reginald had very good lawyers and a very long memory. She poured herself tea she didn't drink and stared at his handwriting. "Bring whoever you like." She set the invitation face down on the table and didn't think about it again for 4 days. People who hadn't known Mara before the marriage sometimes assumed she had always been this careful, this quiet, this measured. The women in her new neighborhood probably thought she was just another transplant, professional, private, uncomplicated. They didn't know about the Mara who had spent 7 years building Thorngate Communications from a shared office and 2 freelance clients into something that took up an entire floor on Spark Street. They didn't know she had negotiated their first government contract at 31, 9 months pregnant, in a boardroom full of men who kept glancing at her belly like it was a liability clause. They didn't know because Mara didn't talk about it much anymore. There was a particular kind of grief that came with losing something you had built with your own hands. Something different from losing something you'd been given. When she signed the papers transferring her shares of Thorngate Communications to Reginald as part of the settlement, she had felt it in her chest like a physical thing, a door closing on a room she had spent a decade furnishing. What the divorce papers didn't say, what no legal document could capture, was the way it had happened. Not gradually, not in the slow erosion that ended so many marriages, but in a single evening in November 2 years ago, when she came home early from a conference in Vancouver and found Reginald in their kitchen making dinner for Claudette Marsh. Claudette Marsh, 34, beautiful in the specific way that photographed well, a former lifestyle journalist who had pivoted to corporate communications consulting and ended up in Reginald's orbit sometime the previous spring. Mara had met her twice at industry events and found her perfectly pleasant. She had no reason not to. Reginald's explanation, delivered while Claudette gathered her things with the focused efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this moment, was almost admirably concise. He said he hadn't planned it. He said these things happened. He said Mara had been so consumed by the business for so long that they had grown apart, and he needed someone who was present. He used the word present 4 times in 11 minutes. Mara counted, later, when she was replaying the conversation in her head at 2 in the morning in the guest room. She moved out 2 weeks later. The divorce took 14 months. Thorngate Communications, which had been restructured with joint ownership during their marriage at Reginald's suggestion, "It's just cleaner, Mara, for tax purposes," went to him in the settlement along with the house and the cottage in Prince Edward County. She got the Toronto Apartment Fund, a portion of their investments, and the understanding that she was starting over at 41 with a legal bill she hadn't finished paying. Claudette, she heard through people who still talked to both of them, had moved into the Acacia Avenue house by spring. The invitation sat face down on her kitchen table. On the 5th day, Mara flipped it over and read it again. She wasn't sure what Reginald wanted her to feel. Probably small. Probably grateful for the gesture. Grateful enough to show up looking like what she was. A woman rebuilding, wearing last season's gown, arriving alone in a taxi. A useful contrast to whatever he and Claudette would be wearing, whatever table they would be presiding over. She could picture it exactly. Reginald in the charcoal suit he saved for important evenings. Claudette in something that would be featured in the social pages of Ottawa magazine the following month. Their friends, her former friends arranged around them like a tableau, and her slipping in from the side, being gracious about it. Being the gracious ex-wife. Confirming, for everyone who needed confirming, that Reginald had upgraded. She picked up her phone and called her sister. "Don't go," Noelle said immediately. "I know. There's no version of this where he's inviting you out of kindness. I know that too." A pause. "So why are you calling me instead of throwing it in the recycling?" Mara looked at the invitation. "Because I think I want to go." Noelle was quiet for a moment. "Okay, tell me why." "Because I'm tired of disappearing," Mara said. "I gave him the company. I gave him the house. I moved to a city where nobody knows me. I have been disappearing for a year and a half, and I would like to stop." Another pause. "So go," Noelle said, "but go right." She had met Desmond Okafor-Webb the previous autumn at a conference on media and technology in Montreal. She had been there as a speaker, her first public appearance since the divorce. A panel on digital communication strategy that she had almost canceled 4 times. He had been in the back row, which she noticed because most people at these things positioned themselves visibly, near the front, where the right people could see them paying attention. Afterward, he had found her at the reception and introduced himself with the directness she would come to recognize as his baseline. Not a performance of confidence, just a man who had decided some years ago not to waste time on indirection. He was the founder and CEO of Okafor-Webb Media Group, which she knew by reputation, one of the fastest-growing independent media companies in the country, headquartered in Halifax, recently expanded into Ontario and British Columbia. He was also, she discovered over the next 40 minutes, genuinely interested in what she'd said on the panel, specifically the part about institutional communication failures during corporate transitions. They had stayed in touch, professionally at first. He'd asked her to consult on a restructuring project, which she'd done remotely over the fall. Then more personally, gradually, in the way that two people who are both careful by nature take their time about things. She called him on a Tuesday evening in February. "There's a gala," she said. "The Chateau Laurier, March 15th. Children's Hospital Foundation. My ex-husband sent me an invitation, and I believe he intends to use me as a prop." "That's a very considered assessment," Desmond said. What is it you're planning to do about it?" "I'm planning to go," Mara said. "And I'd like to go with you if you're available. But I want to be clear about what I'm asking. I'm not asking you to perform anything on my behalf. I'm not asking you to rescue me. She stopped. "I'd like to walk in with someone who knows exactly what the situation is." There was a brief silence. "The 15th, he said. "I'll clear the evening." "You don't have to, Mara. I'll clear the evening." She exhaled. "Thank you." "Don't thank me," he said. "I've been looking for an excuse to wear that suit again." She spent the next 3 weeks working. This was not unusual. Work had been her anchor through everything that had happened, the thing that kept her tethered to something resembling routine. She had started a consulting practice out of the Toronto apartment, small at first, a handful of clients she'd cultivated from her network. In the months since Montreal, Desmond had referred 2 of his contacts to her, and she had converted both into retainer clients. She was not struggling, not precisely. She was in the particular financial limbo of someone who had been set back significantly, but had the competence to climb out if she was patient. She bought a dress. Not the most expensive thing in the boutique on Bloor Street, but close to it, a deep burgundy that she would not have worn during her marriage, because Reginald preferred her in neutrals, in things that complemented rather than commanded. She had not fully understood until after the divorce how many of her choices had been made in reference to Reginald's preferences. The dress cost more than it should have, and she bought it without apologizing to herself. She did not tell anyone else she was going. Not the 2 friends who had remained genuinely hers after the split. Not her daughter Petra, who was 22 and in her final year at Dalhousie and would have had complicated feelings about the whole thing. She handled the registration herself, confirmed her attendance through the Foundation's office, and on the evening of March 15th, she was ready at 7:15. Desmond arrived at her Toronto hotel room. She'd booked a room at the Rideau Hilton to avoid arriving at the Chateau Laurier from a taxi at 7:30. He looked, she thought, exactly like himself, which was the right thing to look like. He was not performing. He was simply present in the way that he was always present, contained and clear-eyed and entirely at ease. "You look extraordinary," he said. "I feel terrified," she said honestly. "Good," he said. "That means it matters." She picked up her bag. "Let's go." The Fairmont Chateau Laurier at night, in March, with the Peace Tower lit behind it across the canal, was the kind of image that made people remember why they lived in this country. Mara had attended a dozen events here during her years in Ottawa. She knew the limestone corridors, the baronial ceilings, the particular acoustics of the ballroom that made every conversation sound slightly more significant than it was. She did not slow down when they pulled up. She did not check her reflection in the car window or pause to collect herself on the steps. She had decided 2 weeks earlier that she would walk in the same way she had always walked into difficult rooms, which was at full pace and with her chin level. The doors opened. The gala was already well underway. Cocktail hour was ending, and the crowd was beginning to move toward the ballroom for dinner. Several hundred people in their finest, the careful social architecture of a major charitable event. She recognized faces immediately. Former colleagues, a city councillor she'd worked with, 2 journalists from the Ottawa Citizen who had covered Thorngate Communications during its growth years. She felt the shift happen, not dramatically, not the way it happened in films, but the subtle recalibration of a room when someone enters it who is not expected to look the way they look. A few glances that held a beat too long, a conversation that faltered near the bar. Desmond's hand was at the small of her back, not possessively, just present, and she was grateful for it. She saw Reginald from across the room before he saw her. He was standing with the Foundation's executive director and 2 other couples she recognized from their shared social life, the Hendersons, the Fairchilds. He had the posture of a man who was very comfortable, who had organized this evening in his mind and was watching it unfold according to plan. Claudette was beside him in a cream column dress, her hand on his arm, laughing at something. She looked, objectively, beautiful. Mara watched Reginald's eyes move through the room in the practiced way of someone scanning for an expected arrival. She watched the exact moment his gaze landed on her. It was a small thing, a fractional pause, a slight recalibration behind the eyes, the way a person's face adjusts when the information they are receiving does not match the information they anticipated. He had expected, she understood, the careful, quiet version of Mara, the apologetic version, the woman who had spent 18 months becoming smaller. He was looking at something else. He recovered quickly. Reginald was always quick, and arranged his expression into something hospitable. But she had seen it. She had seen the moment before the recovery, and that was enough. What happened next was not a confrontation. She wanted to be clear about that, to herself and to anyone who later asked. She had not come to the Chateau Laurier to cause a scene. She had not come to make Reginald feel small or to perform a reversal for the benefit of an audience. She had come because she was tired of being someone who didn't show up to her own life. And this was her life, her city, her foundation, her history in this room. She crossed the floor with Desmond. She stopped to speak with the Foundation's executive director, a woman named Harriet Colson, whom Mara had worked alongside on the hospital's communications committee 3 years earlier. Harriet's expression when she saw Mara was genuinely warm, the slightly surprised warmth of someone who had wondered what had happened to a person and was relieved to find out the answer was this. "Mara," Harriet said, "I didn't know you'd be here tonight." "I wouldn't have missed it," Mara said, which was true now if not 3 weeks ago. She introduced Desmond. Harriet, who read the business press, recognized his name immediately, the slight widening of the eyes. The handshake held a half-second longer. She asked about Okafor Web Media Group's expansion into Ontario. He answered thoughtfully and without preening. Mara watched Harriet recalibrate Mara herself upward in real time, which was a small and human thing to observe. Reginald arrived at her elbow 4 minutes later. He had always had good timing, which had once seemed like a skill and now felt like a symptom. He put on the right face, generous, collegial, the face of a man who bore no ill will and wanted the world to know it. "Mara," he said, "I'm glad you came." "Thank you for the invitation," she said. "You look well." He was taking in Desmond, trying to place him failing. This was unusual for Reginald, who made it his business to know everyone worth knowing in certain circles. "I am well," she said. "Reginald, this is Desmond Okafor-Webb. Des, this is Reginald Thorne." She watched Reginald's face absorb the name. She watched the moment he placed it. The media group, the expansion, the profile piece in the Globe and Mail last November. She watched, very briefly, the architecture of the evening he had planned shift beneath him. "Of course," Reginald said, extending his hand with the slightly elevated warmth he deployed for people he considered important. "I've followed Okafor-Webb Media closely. Impressive growth." "Thank you," Desmond said, pleasant, unhurried, giving Reginald nothing more than that. Claudette appeared at Reginald's side. The introduction was made. She was gracious. Mara had to give her that. Genuinely gracious, not the performance of it. She asked how Mara was doing in Toronto, and Mara told her honestly that the consulting practice was going well, that she had a strong client base developing, that she liked the city. All of this was true. She watched Claudette try to map this Mara onto the version she had perhaps been told about, and find the edges didn't quite match. The dinner bell rang. People began moving toward their tables. They were not seated near each other, which Mara suspected Reginald had arranged and was now quietly grateful for. Her table was near the windows, with a view of the Ottawa River dark under a winter sky. She sat with Harriet and her husband, a retired judge named Clifton, who told very good stories, and two couples she hadn't met before, a cardiologist from the Ottawa Heart Institute and her partner, and a woman who ran a venture capital firm in Kanata, and her husband who wrote literary fiction. It was a good table. It was unexpectedly a genuinely good evening. Desmond was easy company, in the way that people are easy when they have nothing to prove. He talked about the media landscape in Atlantic Canada with the cardiologist's partner, who had grown up in Cape Breton. He and Clifton discovered a shared interest in Canadian legal history that produced a 20-minute conversation Mara followed with genuine interest. He was curious about the VC firm founder's work in a way that produced a business card exchange. She watched this and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not triumph. She was honest enough with herself to know that some part of her had wanted this evening to be a triumph, and she was making peace with the fact that it was something quieter than that. What she felt was more like recognition. A recognition of herself, sitting in a room she had every right to sit in, with a person who had chosen to be there with her, being seen as someone with a life that was actually going somewhere. It was enough. It was, she realized quietly, more than enough. She caught sight of Reginald twice during dinner. Once when the Foundation's executive director gave a brief address and she saw him at his table, watching the dais with the attentive expression of someone performing attentiveness. Once near the dessert course when he glanced across the room to her table, and she was laughing at something Clifton had said, and did not notice him looking until afterward, when Desmond said quietly, "Your ex-husband has been watching you for about 20 minutes. "I know," she said. "How are you feeling about that?" She considered the question honestly. "Like I made the right choice," she said. "Coming here?" Desmond nodded. He didn't say anything more, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate about him. He understood when something didn't need a response. What she learned the following week came not from anyone she had spoken to at the gala, but from Harriet, who called to thank her for coming and mentioned it almost incidentally. The way people mention things they think you probably already know. Thorngate Communications had lost its two largest government contracts the previous month. A procurement review had flagged irregularities in the initial bidding process. Nothing criminal, Harriet was careful to say, but the kind of process failures that made renewal uncomfortable for all parties. The contracts had gone to a different firm. Thorngate would survive, but significantly reduced. Reginald had apparently been hoping the gala would be a good evening for relationship repair with some of the people who mattered to those renewal decisions. Mara sat with this information for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't know that, I thought." Harriet paused. "I suppose I assumed someone would have told you." We don't really speak, Mara said. Of course. A pause. For what it's worth, Mara, a number of people were asking about you after you left. About your consulting practice. I gave out your card to 2 or 3 people. I hope that's all right. That's very all right, Mara said. She put down the phone and looked out the window at the Toronto skyline. February had finally given up, and it was starting, tentatively, to look like March. There was a quality of light on the water that suggested things were loosening. She had not set out to watch Reginald's evening unravel. She had not planned it, not anticipated it, not even fully registered it happening in real time. She had simply been in the room entirely herself, and the evening had arranged itself around that. She thought about the invitation with his careful handwriting on the envelope. Bring whoever you like, she almost laughed. 2 months later, on a Thursday afternoon in May, Mara flew to Halifax to finalize the scope of an ongoing project with Okafor Web Media Group. The work itself had grown significantly. What had started as a restructuring consultation had evolved into something closer to a communications partnership, with Mara's practice functioning as the strategic lead on several major initiatives. She had hired 2 contractors in March. She was looking at office space. Desmond met her at the airport. They had been navigating something personal, carefully and honestly for several months by then, with the deliberateness of 2 people who had both made the mistake of not being deliberate before. It was not fully named yet, but it was real, and they both understood that. Over dinner that night at a restaurant on the waterfront, he told her the media group was planning a significant expansion announcement, a new national division, a press event in Ottawa in the fall. He wanted her practice to lead the communications strategy. That's a big ask, she said. It's exactly the right size for what you've built, he said. She looked at him across the table. The harbor was darkening outside the windows, the last of the May light going amber on the water. She thought about the woman who had sat at a kitchen table in February with a face-down invitation and a cup of cold tea, trying to decide whether she was brave enough to show up to her own life. All right, she said. Yes. She called her daughter that evening from the hotel. Petra answered on the second ring, which meant she wasn't in the middle of something, which meant she had time to actually talk, which was a gift Mara had learned not to take for granted. How's Halifax? Petra asked. Good, Mara said. Really good, actually. Yeah? There was something in her daughter's voice. Careful, hopeful. The tone of someone who had been watching a parent go through something difficult and was listening for signs that it was shifting. Yeah, Mara said. I think things are shifting. Petra was quiet for a moment. Then, good. That's good, Mum. She sounded like she meant it, which she did. And Mara felt the truth of it settle into her chest somewhere and stay there. Outside, Halifax was doing the thing it did in May evenings. That particular Atlantic quality of light and air that made the world feel briefly clarified, as if everything unnecessary had been stripped back, and what remained was only what was real. She stood at the window for a while after she hung up. Not thinking about Reginald, not thinking about Ottawa, not thinking about the years she had spent diminishing herself in small ways she hadn't fully noticed until she stopped. She thought about the dress, the burgundy dress that she had bought without apologizing to herself. She thought about walking through those doors. She thought about the particular quiet satisfaction of taking up exactly as much space as you are owed, in exactly the room where someone hoped you would make yourself small, and discovering that the room could hold you after all.